Gas and bloating, well, that can happen to anyone. But today I'm going to show you how to have the perfect defense against this. No jokes, no hyperbole. I'm just going to show you the facts of how to build your defenses against gas and bloating. Hey guys, I'm Dr. Arland Hill out at Harvest Hills Ranch. And gas and bloating from time to time happens to everyone, but on a routine basis, if you're dealing with it fairly consistently, you may be dealing with something that's called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, let me be pretty frank about this. There are numerous causes for gas and bloating, but by far one of the more common causes for that is this overgrowth of bacteria that occurs in the small intestine. Now, why doesn't this happen to everyone? Well, one of the reasons that it doesn't happen to everyone is because some individuals have better defense lines against this overgrowth of bacteria than others. And many individuals that are struggling with this have allowed these defense lines to be broken down. They're not working at a high level. And what I want to emphasize before we delve into what these defense lines are and what you can do about them, one of the things that I want you to appreciate is that these defense lines are inherent in everyone. They're part of our normal physiology. They're part of the normal way that our body functions. And therefore, we must be doing something to inhibit the adequate functioning of these defense lines. So with that introduction, let's take each one of these and let's talk about why it's important, what it's actually doing, and what you can do to rebuild these, if not just temporarily, but permanently. So the first one, and I'm going to take a top-down, or maybe stated differently, a north-south approach on this as we go through the gastrointestinal tract. And I'm going to share an image with you here. Let me give you an idea. I want to give us a basic understanding of looking at the gastrointestinal tract as it sits in the abdominal cavity. There are multiple aspects that we're going to talk about here. We're going to jump into some conversation around the stomach. We're going to talk about the liver as it relates to this, and the pancreas, because these are important components to building this defense line. So if we start at the top here, one of the areas that we need to focus on right out of the gate is going to be the stomach. Now, most of us think of the stomach as just the first place that our food goes to start the digestive process. And that's a good initial thought, but then we need to ask, well, what is taking place in the stomach, among other things that are promoting this digestive process? And this is going to be a theme that you're going to see with each one of these defense lines, is that they don't just act as defense lines, they also play roles in digestion. So that's a key point to note here, is that if you're dealing with this gas and bloating and it's fairly persistent, it doesn't seem to resolve no matter what you do, then that probably also means that you're not completely digesting your food, and you're probably ending up with both micronutrient and macronutrient deficiencies. And so that's stated a little differently, would simply mean that things like your B vitamins and your minerals on the micronutrient side would not be in adequate supply. You'd have deficiencies in those. On the macronutrient side, if we were talking about things like proteins, proteins are one of the areas that are often inhibited from being completely broken down, and they have to be broken down to a small enough size to be efficiently absorbed. So there's a high probability that you're not utilizing the proteins that you're taking in. So let me show the image again, and I want to make a point here that we're starting in the stomach. And remember, we're talking about this from digestion as it leads into creating this defense line. So when food goes into the stomach and it's producing what's called chyme, ultimately we're releasing acid. This is a critical initial step in the digestive process, and we want to get the acid. There needs to be sufficient enough acid in the stomach to be able to drop the pH down low enough to break down the protein sources that are coming in. But the nice byproduct of this process as well is that not only are you breaking down the foods that are coming in, you're also allowing that acid to have direct interaction with these various microorganisms. Bacteria most prevalently, as we're going to be talking about here, but also fungus, even parasites coming through can also be interrupted in their growth cycles, and the number of those that may enter into the stomach would be significantly less when it comes into contact with an adequate amount of acid in the stomach. So your first defense line against gas and bloating is just simply going to be having an adequate amount of acid. Let's move on from there. And from the stomach, things are going to move into the upper portion of the small intestine. That's what's otherwise known as the duodenum. And within the duodenum, we're going to find that the liver and the pancreas are going to be the most important organs that we're going to talk about in this area. And with regards to the liver, you'll see the liver being fairly large here. There's many ducts in the liver, and they all funnel down to release bile, and that's stored in the gallbladder. When you eat a meal, especially a meal with more fat in it, the liver and the gallbladder is the gallbladder more specifically is going to contract, and it's going to release that bile into the small intestine. Now, any of these bacteria, these organisms that have made it through the stomach and find themselves in the small intestine, in the upper small intestine, they are going to initially come into contact with that bile. And that bile has direct antimicrobial activity as well. Now, the bile changes as it goes through the small intestine, so its antibacterial effect begins to change as well. But right as it's coming out of the liver, this bile production is extremely important because it's knocking down those colonies of bacteria at an even greater pace. So that's your second defense line. So number one, you had acid. Number two, you had your bile. Now, coming out of the pancreas, and let me share with you here, pancreas is a bit hard to see in this illustration, but this yellow area that you see behind the liver back here, that's the pancreas, and the pancreas is going to flow down into, there's a duct there that flows down into the small intestine as well, comes out in the same areas that the bile does from the gallbladder. And here we're also going to find our third defense line, and the enzymes are going to break down and start to decrease the numbers of bacteria even greater. So we have the first drop in bacterial levels from acid. The next level is going to be from the bile in the small intestine, and then you go one level more, and the enzymes that are coming out of the pancreas are going to drop those levels of bacteria a third time. And so really these are not acting in a stepwise sequential process. They're acting, especially when we talk about bile and enzymes, those are happening roughly at the same time, but the end result is the same. So conceptually, we just talk about it in three different ways so we can visualize where a system may break down. How do you deal with this? That's really the crux of what we need to understand here, right? And so one way that you can deal with this, if we just take each one of these three areas, is that if we see that there is a reduction in acid, then that means that we can add a supplemental form of acid. This is often known as betaine hydrochloride. You can use ammonium chloride to help with this. There are other nutrients that are responsible for supporting the production of acid: zinc, B1, chloride. These all come into the conversation for that. So deficiencies in those may be a factor there, or some type of damage to the acid producing cells in the gut. Different organisms such as H. pylori can do this. I'll talk about that down the road. But the point here is that we need to figure out where that lack of acid, what that's attributable to, and we can replace that acid for a period of time or address the cause that's not allowing that acid to be produced. That's step one. From there, we need to think about enzymes. So I'll come back to the bile in a moment because that's a bit different. But the reason we need to immediately think about enzymes as we talk about acid is because the acid ultimately triggers the secretion of enzymes from the pancreas. Once that pH drops low enough, it becomes an indicator that food is going to continue to move from the stomach to the small intestine, and we need to prime the small intestine to be ready for that food, and more specifically at that point it's called chyme, for that chyme that's coming through so that the enzymes can be released on that to further the digestive process where they're working on proteins, fats, and carbohydrates here. Now, when someone has this overgrowth that's attributable to the bacteria, we generally, right out of the gate, don't want to use enzymes at a high level. We want to generally focus more on the acid and bring the enzymes, increase the enzymes as necessary as we go through the antimicrobial process. And to say that a different way, as we're going through the process of using antibiotics, antimicrobials, things that are going to reduce that bacterial overgrowth, we can, as we go through that process, we can bring up the amount of the enzymes that are being utilized. There is some concern with bringing those on too fast, that you may actually provide more resources to that bacteria, because remember, when we have this overgrowth of bacteria, it's a competitive process in there in the small intestine. They're vying for the same resources that we are. Therefore, we don't want to give them open access to those. They typically want those in the upper small intestine. So if we can hold off on doing that, use the acid to support that digestive process, that's generally going to be a better strategy right out of the gate. So that's your second option. There is some enzymatic support with that, whether it's amylase, lipase, protease. These are just going to be some enzymes that you'll often see in digestive enzyme support. And then the third option here is going to be, how do we support bile? Well, we can directly do that with a replacement known as ox bile. But we can also do that by increasing the utilization of things like taurine and other nutrients that are going to help us promote the production of bile acids. So as these bile acids are formed, they're going to accumulate and increase in density in the gallbladder, as we referred to earlier, and then they get released into the small intestine. So those are all strategies we can use to improve these defense lines. But again, the idea here really comes down to, if we want to improve these defense lines, we want to improve them long term. So I've given you some recommendations on the short term, but we also have to ask the question of, where is this coming from long term? Because ultimately we don't want to get into a pattern where we're relapsing here. And so what that may mean is that you have to dig in and you have to figure out, do I have infections that are contributing to this scenario? Do I have a chronic stress state? That I'm saying that very generically. There could be a number of factors that play into that. These are all things that are going to reduce the secretions of your gastric secretions. Chronic inflammatory states are going to play a role in this. So there's a lot of possibilities here that could be considered. It's just variable from person to person. But this is at least the avenue that you need to think about going forward. You want to rebuild your defense lines, Use supplementation as necessary to do that, but ultimately think long term about what's inhibiting the production of these gastric secretions on an ongoing basis. So with that all being said, guys, I hope you found this information helpful. I hope it's something that you can apply to your own health and start to get some relief from your gas and bloating, especially if that's something that you've been dealing with for a long time. And keep in mind, this scenario that I'm sharing with you has an extremely high relapse rate. So be diligent about what you're doing and be consistent about it. Make long-term consistent choices with your health, and don't get in a pattern where you're repeating the same scenario of, you improve the gas and bloating, but then it comes back. You improve the gas and bloating, but then it comes back. That's the epitome of frustration. So don't let that be you. Hey, if you want to know more about what I do, guys, hey, go to drarlandhill.com. And if you want to find out about how to support your body with uncompromising nutrition that is produced the right way, go to harvesthillsranch.com and find out about how Leah and I produce uncompromising quality food that can support each of these health conditions that we talk about here on the channel. Until next time, guys, we'll see you soon.